I would like to say, Marvin, that I'm delighted to have you at this 4th International Conference on Architecture.
Grande prazer tê-lo aqui conosco nesse congresso, no 4º Congresso Internacional de Arquitetura e Teatro, Cultura.
In Unirio, in Brazil, I know it's much more, but in Unirio. And we learn a lot from you. Every time we learn quite a lot. The entire laboratory team thanks you for your presence. We are sure all the audience knows about your amazing background, but I will present it as usual, okay?
Fine.
Marvin Carlson is the Sidney E. Cohn Professor of Theatre and Comparative Literature at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. He has received the honorary doctorate from the University of Athens, the ATHE Career Achievement Award, the ASTR Distinguished Scholarship Award, the Georges Jonathan Award for Dramatic Criticism, and the Callaway Prize for Writing in Theatre. He is the founding editor of the journal Western European Stages and the author of over 100 scholarly articles in theatre history, theatre theory, the dramatic literature. Among his books are The Theatre of the French Revolution, Goethe and the Weimar Theatre, Theories of the Theatre, we know it very well in Brazil, Places of Performance, we know it very well at the laboratory, Theatre Semiotics, Science of Life, Performance, a Critical Introduction, Voltaire in the theatre of the 18th century, The Haunted Stage, which has just been translated in Portuguese, Speaking in Tongues, Theatre is More Beautiful Than War, and the theatres of Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia. His work has been translated into 14 languages, and I'm happy to announce that The Haunted Stage has already been translated into Portuguese. Let's start our presentation. Please, Marvin, delighted of having you here with us in Unirio.
Thank you so much, Evelyn. It's a delight to me to be back with you again. I always enjoyed the conferences and my trips to Brazil. My only sadness is that I'm not there with you right now.
Yes, we are sad
I would love
too.
to be there. So maybe next year or the year after we'll be able to do this. In any case, thank you so much. I'm going to be speaking this afternoon about an interesting aspect of the of theater history and theater architecture, the history of the Monumental Theatre. So let's go to the next slide, please. Thank you. During the classic period, when Greece and then Rome dominated the Western world, and cities of their empires were centers of art and culture, one of the most distinctive features of these cities were their monumental theaters, whose spatial dominance was so important that still today, the most distinctive feature of the ruins of many of their ancient cities are the remnants of the city theater. This is a feature found throughout the Greco-Roman world, from the Atlantic to East Asia, from Britain to North Africa. At the end of the classic period, its theater culture disappeared, and these great monuments fell into ruins. It was not until the mid-18th century that the concept of the monumental theater as a central urban element came back. From then onward, it became an important element in city planning, and in significant measure, due to European colonialism, the idea spread around the globe. By the 21st century, major cities around the world were committed to the development of monumental theaters. Just as in the classic period, these theaters are a significant part of the city's cultural identity and central to a city's public image, even in some cases becoming a symbol of the city itself. Every part of the world has shared in this development, and it is important to note that throughout Europe, that although Europe, which created the Monumental Theatre, has produced important examples of the modern equivalent of such structures, the real center of monumental theaters today is Asia, and particularly China. Unlike the fairly standardized structures of the classic period, these new monumental theaters are dazzling in their variety, in shapes, materials, and iconic references. In part, this is due to the stunning variety of artistic and cultural sources upon which they draw, but in part toward a desire to impress and even astonish the spectator. Whatever their variety, these contemporary theaters share this feature with their classic ancestors. The number and variety of monumental theaters is today so great that any discussion of them must be limited. And I apologize for the many wonderful examples I have had to exclude. What I hope to do today is present a fairly brief history of the development of the monumental theater since its reinvention in the mid-18th century. Interesting example. The monumental theater tradition disappeared in the West along with the Greek and Roman empires of which it was part. And it did not reappear until the mid-18th century, when influential European theorists and architects turned with new interest to classical architecture, and that included classical theater buildings. Voltaire, in particular, complained of the insignificant and poorly designed theater buildings in France in his time. Here we see a typical example. And compared these rather small and insignificant buildings to the great structures of classical Greece and Rome. In the preface to his 1748 play, Semiramis, he called for new theater buildings, which would be like their classic ancestors, and I quote, "They would be magnificent and splendid public monuments facing major public squares with peristyles and porticos, suggesting temples and palaces," unquote. With such buildings, he argued, modern Paris could become the equal of ancient Rome. Voltaire's vision led to the establishment of the modern monumental theater, the first example of which was built not in Paris, but in Berlin in 1745. The new king there, Frederick the Great, came to the throne in 1740, and he sought to make his capital the architectural equivalent of classical Athens or Rome. He welcomed Voltaire to come to Berlin to help him in this design, and the centerpiece was a monumental opera house opening onto a huge new public square. The classical elements, including the peristyles and porticos suggesting temples and palaces that Voltaire wished, are clearly in evidence here. In addition to opening a new style of theater architecture, the Berlin Opera was the first major public building in neoclassic style, which would soon become the dominant mode for major public buildings and monuments all over Europe, not only theaters. During the Renaissance and Baroque periods, many lavish theaters were built. They were normally the property of rulers and aristocrats and were literally located within the homes of their owners. Supporters of this tradition resisted attempts, especially in Paris, to create an independent monumental theater building like the Berlin Opera outside of any other building. But as early as 1754, a fairly modest theater in this new style was built in the provincial town of Lyon by Jacques Soufflet. The building in Lyon is a similar sort of temple-like building. Louis XV's building superintendent, Marigny, called this building, I quote, "the only real theater in France." Marigny sent representatives to study theaters in England, Germany, and Italy, and to consult with Voltaire. Oh, we're getting it's the next one after this. and even to consider a monumental theater for Paris. Good. In 1771, the major French architectural work of the period, Blondel's Cours d'Architecture, observed that, I quote, "Nothing contributes so much to the magnificence of a city as a public theater, and these edifices should indicate by their grandeur and exterior disposition the importance of the city in which they are located," unquote. Neoclassic style was from the beginning regarded as the best place to look for such grandeur. A major contributor to this was the visionary architect Claude Nicolas Ledoux, who created a highly innovative theater in 1777, drawing inspiration from Palladio, a favorite of neoclassic architects. Even more ambitious and more influential was a major new public theater designed by Victor Louis in Bordeaux in 1792. The Bordeaux Theatre, in turn, became the model for subsequent neoclassic monumental theaters in France and elsewhere well into the following century. Louis himself went on to design the first theater of this type in Paris itself, a new home for the Comédie Française, which opened in 1790. By the end of the 18th century, this is the new Paris theater. The idea of the theater as a public monument and a central element in each major city was firmly established in France, and the continuing cultural dominance of France assured the steady spread of this idea throughout Europe, and then as part of the colonial project around the world. The next two are illustrating how this is spread around the world. There's a picture of the Federal Street Theater in Boston in the United States, and a theater in Cape Town, South Africa, the first South African theater. Both of them are built in this style. The classical elements advocated by Voltaire, the portico, the columns, the triangular peristyle, all these were part of the general architectural vocabulary now of theaters. And the next slide shows 3 theaters in Europe that all have these elements. Yes, here we have the first theater in Boston on the left and the first theater in South Africa on the right. And you'll notice, even though they're fairly simple, they have a Greek style. More examples, the Grassland Theater and in France on the left. At the bottom, La Monnaie, an important theater in Belgium in 1825. And to the right, the Bowery Theater in New York. These were from the 18 teens and 20s. And you see all of them have the same kind of neoclassic facades and columns. Indeed, this very point was made in 1883 in a published description of the theaters in London, and it criticized this style of theater. This is Robert, and talking about Robert Smirke's 1837 rebuilding of Covent Garden, one of the major theaters in London. The author of this book complained about Covent Garden, saying it looked like a temple. It was too solemn for a theater. This is it, yes, and the book was complaining it looked more like a church than a theater. Despite such critical reservations, however, neoclassicism like this was becoming standard for major monumental theaters, and this could be seen at Drury Lane's major at Covent Garden. At Drury Lane, Covent Garden's major rival. Yes, this is the other major theater in London, and to the left we see it before a remodeling, and to the right after a remodeling in 1827, where essentially been added is Greek, Greek entrances with the portico and suggestion of temple and so on. Benjamin Wyatt's rebuilding of this theater was rather simple and severe, but it was remodeled in 1827, as we see on the right, adding fashionable neoclassic porticos and bringing it much more in line with contemporary taste. A major impetus for the building of new monumental theaters was the rise of nationalism in the early 19th century. And as emerging countries began to stress their new nationalism and their national characters, an important part of this was building new national theaters. And these national theaters were very much in the monumental style. The next slide shows some of the new national theaters: the National Theatre of Hungary, the National Theatre of Serbia, the National Theatre of Romania. These all built in the 1830s to 1850s. Monumental public theaters from the mid-19th century onward continued to work in the tradition of neoclassicism. Central to a new consciousness of pride in national and cultural identity was the establishment of these new national theaters. And interestingly enough, the nationalism was shown in the plays presented, in the language of the theater, in the directors of the theater, but not in the architecture. That is, a Hungarian national theater did not look Hungarian, or a Romanian did not look like Romanian architecture. They all, throughout Europe, followed the standard model of looking like Greek temples. As the 19th century passed, new national theaters and the spread of European culture around the world made this monumental neoclassic theater a global style, still significant when going into the next century. So the next slide after that one, we're 2 slides behind now. The next slide after that one shows national theaters toward the end of the century, not in Europe, but around the world, that are still being done. That are still being done in the neoclassic style. And I show the National Theater of Costa Rica in the Americas, the Hanoi Opera in Vietnam, in Indochina, the Marienburg Theater in North Korea. Now these theaters are national theaters in Europe in the middle of the century: the Hungarian National Theater, the Romanian National Theater, the Serbian National Theater. This shows national theaters that were built later in the century. Oops, not there yet. Back one, please. These are theaters built later in the century in Asia. Well, the first one, the one up the upper left, is Costa Rica. The other two are Hanoi, Indochina, and Pyongyang, North Korea. You see, in all parts of the world, we have variations on the French neoclassic style. During the 1860s and 1870s in Europe, however, this dominant neoclassic model, which people had been following for almost 100 years, building new monumental theaters, was challenged by a new style. This new style also began in France and was named the Bozart Style. Bozart means the fine arts in France. And it's named after the School of Fine Arts in Paris. This new style, like neoclassicism, sought to impress the viewer with its magnificence, and thus the magnificence of the culture that it represented. But instead of coupling this with solemnity and evocation of temples, Bozart Theatre stressed opulence and visual variety, particularly suitable for spectacular display of the most spectacular of theater forms, the opera, and its opera houses that normally were now built in this new style. The best known, one of the very first and the most imitated theater in this style is the the opera in Paris, which we see here, designed by Charles Garnier, which opened in 1875. This theater was not only a magnificent monument itself, but was a very important part of Parisian city planning. That is, part of the redoing of Paris in the 1870s was the opening up of major new boulevards, and these boulevards connected major monuments in the city, like the opera. So that even today, if you look at a map here, you see the opera right in the middle of this aerial view, and notice how all the major streets in the area converge toward it. It's the hub of a number of streets. So that standing in these streets and looking off in the distance, very often the opera will be sort of the defining the end of the street, like a Roman archway or something. And this adds to the monumentality of theater. Not only is it an isolated building, but it is a building that streets converge on, so that it can be a monument you see from a great distance. Much of 1870s Paris is designed around these kinds of perspectives. The designer was the Baron Haussmann. Haussmann's city plan for Paris was widely imitated throughout the Western Hemisphere. The placement of a major monumental theater at a Haussmann hub of streets became a standard element in such plans. And in many cities, the theater was created in the fashionable Bozart style, imitating the opera, often in close imitation of it. Undoubtedly, the most famous such imitation was in Brazil, in the boom town of Manaus in the remote Amazonian jungle. From 1879 to 1912, the Amazon basin was the essentially supplier of rubber essential to the Industrial Revolution, and Belém, at the mouth of the Amazon, and Manaus, further inland, rapidly changed from modest villages to two of the wealthiest cities in Brazil and indeed in the world. This is the opera house built in Manaus, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with, and as you can see, it's very much in the opulent, almost excessive style of the opera, of the Paris opera. The boom affected coastal Belém first, and Belém built a national theater, which we see to the left. But at that point, when the Belém Theater was built, the Opera had not opened yet. And so the Belém Theater, although it's definitely a monumental theater, rather looks back to the neoclassic style rather than to the Beaux-Arts style. So you see a kind of transitional movement here. At the very beginning of the 20th century, the rapidly expanding city of Rio de Janeiro undertook a vast rebuilding of its central city. And that rebuilding in Rio, as most of you, I imagine, know, was modeled on the city plan of Paris. And that included a rather exact model, which we see here, of the Garnier Opera in Paris, a monumental theater, very much the same style and size, isolated and also laid out in the city so that major streets converged on the Opera. As in Paris, a monumental vista opened into this theater, and as if you stand on if you stand in the front of the theater and look south, you look down a very Haussmann-like main street that runs directly into the theater. But at the other end of that street, which has its own vista, is a view of Sugarloaf Mountain, the most iconic view of Rio. So in fact, the Rio has a street with a view even better than what Haussmann was able to do in Paris. It's the same aesthetic that he's working on. This is this is inside the theater, looking the Rio Theatre, looking down the monumental boulevard in front of it, and you can see at the very end, framed by the boulevard, Sugarloaf Mountain, a very French concept. So it's important to see that monumental theaters of this kind were not only monuments themselves, but were located in positions that allowed the city to emphasize their monument. Sao Paulo, the traditional rival of Rio, was rather more oriented toward Italy than France and did not undertake a Haussmann style makeover, but it still could not resist the prestige of a Garnier-inspired theater. So even though it doesn't have the network of streets that reinforce this, actual theater is very much in the French style, and you can see great similarities between this and the Rio Theatre and the Paris Opera. The Beaux-Arts style continued to influence monumental theater design, especially in the French colonies, until all into the early 20th century. And the next slide shows the Beaux-Arts style in the French colonies in Indonesia. There we are, in Ho Chi Minh City on the upper left, in the Municipal Theatre of Tunis, which we see at the bottom here, and in the Oran Theatre in Algeria, that you see it to the right here, all built at the very beginning of the 20th century. By the opening years of the 20th century, however, this very decorative, ornate, even cluttered Beaux-Arts style was being replaced by a new approach in public design that affected architecture of all sorts of public buildings, and was really almost a reaction to the Beaux-Arts style. There still was the idea that the theater should be a public theater should be a major public monument, but instead of trying to impress this kind of ornate decoration, it was they followed the new style, which we now call modernism, which was launched by Le Corbusier, the architect in France, and the Bauhaus movement in Germany. And this movement, modernism, then became the dominant architectural form in theaters and elsewhere in the 20th century. As I say, in many respects, modernism was almost directly opposed to Beaux-Arts style. While Beaux-Arts buildings covered over their structural elements with dazzling displays of decoration and detail, modernist designers instead emphasized structure and function over decoration, tried to go for simplicity and clean lines. Some of them used neoclassic columns, as we see in these buildings, but around them was a much more formal and simple kind of architectural facade, very different from the Beaux-Arts style. Relying heavily on steel structures, glass, and poured concrete, they composed structures that offered large blank walls, stressing horizontal and vertical lines, and built upon basic geometrical shapes, rectangular, cylindrical, or cubic. They by no means gave up monumentality, as you can see in these three buildings, all European, but they sought to impress the viewer with the power, beauty, or inventiveness of their structural designs rather than the elaborateness of their detail. The most extreme form of these tendencies appeared around. Oh, I'm sorry. I had a second slide. These are more modernist buildings, and again, you can see how very simple geometric shapes are replacing the kind of elaborate detail of the Beaux-Arts style. The most extreme form of these tendencies appeared around the middle of the century in a variation of modernism called brutalism. Although the name suggests brutality or violence, it actually comes from the French word brut, meaning raw or untreated, a reference to building materials, especially the increasingly popular concrete. And here's a concrete building. Again, a theater building is generally acknowledged as the outstanding representation of this style, often when people say, what's the best example of brutalism? They show a theater, a monumental theater, which is this one. This is, as many of you will recognize, this is the National Theatre of Great Britain. Which was completed in 1977. Brutalism was not a highly popular style, but it was used for a number of major monumental theaters in the 1960s and 70s, and we see some examples of them here. In these later examples, as for example, the Alley Theater of Houston, which is the one we see at the bottom right here, the iconic right angles and this kind of love of large blank spaces was softened a bit by the introduction of curves. You see, the early brutalists, there was almost never a curve; it was always right angles. But you see, the Alley Theater is softening that a bit. Still, a monumental theater takes up an entire city block. During the 1960s and 1970s, this softening developed into a new modernist orientation, which is sometimes called organic architecture. And this was opposed to the rigidity, the artificiality, the sharp angles and corners of brutalism. And instead, it championed curved lines that the architects felt were more in harmony with the natural environment. One of the most notable and one of the earliest examples of this was another monumental theater. This is the Schauspielhaus in the German town of Düsseldorf, built in 1970, designed by the German architect Bau, and composed almost entirely of undulating, wavy, concrete poured walls. It shared with brutalism a rejection of imposed decoration. You see, like the brutalists, like the National Theatre in England, it's completely opposed to the kind of highly decorated surface that the Paris Opera has. Instead, you have still the very blank and simple walls, but now curves instead of sharp surfaces and right angles. The international architect most associated with this new organic style was the Brazilian architect Oscar Niemeyer, particularly in his desire to place the curve rather than the straight line at the center of modernist architecture. In a very famous statement, Niemeyer commented, I quote, "I am not attracted to straight angles or to straight lines, hard and inflexible, created by man. I am attracted to free-flowing, sensual curves, the curves that I find in the mountains of my country, in the sinuousness of its rivers, in the waves of the ocean, and in the body of the beloved woman. In the curves make up the entire universe, the curved universe of Einstein." Although Niemeyer himself designed only a few theaters late in his career, his emphasis on the curve is clear from his first individual project, a planned community in 1944, which is a stark contrast to the rectilinear harshness of Le Corbusier and the champions of the straight line. And I have a slide here that's a picture of Niemeyer's first major project, not a theater. Well, I'll go on. The next image is more Niemeyer. Niemeyer designed only a few theaters, and these clearly reflect his continuing dedication to the curve. By the time he designed these theaters, however, architects all over the world were employing this more organic style in the creation of new monumental theaters, as we see here in this theater in Düsseldorf. The next image shows some of these new organic curved line monumentals. All right, this is Niemeyer's first major project. It's a church, not a theater, but it shows you what a different idea he has of the whole structure of a building. It's really just a series of curves. These are actual theaters. In the In the 1970s, architects around Europe were beginning to employ curves as basic design elements. That meant moving away from the sort of, if you think back over all the theaters I've shown you, almost all of them have been boxes, essentially. Even the Paris Opera is just a big box with a very decorated front and sides. Now the box is disappearing and we have all kinds of other ways of organizing space, many of them based on curves. These are new national theaters of the 1870s, the National Theatre of Romania, the Slovak Theatre in Bratislava. The designer of the Chas Theatre in Breda, Netherlands, which we see at the bottom, clearly echoed Niemeyer, not only in style, but he also described his creation. We're on a slide more, suggesting the statue of a reclining woman. New monumental theaters in Africa, as usual, followed European fashions, giving new prominence to the curve. Some followed Niemeyer's suggestion to take inspiration from non-architectural sources. Thus, the Bulgarian company, okay, we can go on to the next one now. Thus, the Bulgarian company that designed the new Nigerian National Theatre opened in 1977, and the work of two successive military regimes took as the inspiration for the theater a military hat. So the theater actually looks like a military hat. We'll see this in a moment. This is now theaters. Here is a new trend, although it grows out of the organic theater. Niemeyer said, imitate natural things, imitate mountains, rivers, or even statuary. Now, some architects are taking that literally and imitating objects, and we'll see several of those. And the first of them that we'll see is this one that imitates a military hat. The 1992 National Theatre of Ghana was described by its designer as suggesting, I quote, a huge ship or a seagull spreading its wings. And this was, here we are. Up in the one in the upper left-hand corner is maybe you don't see this, but it's supposed to look like a military cap, like a general might wear. The bill of the cap is below, and the deck of the front of the cap where you put medals or something is at the top. The theater at the bottom was actually designed by a Chinese architect for the country of Ghana, its national theater, and that's the one that's designed to look like, so the architect says, a huge ship or a seagull spreading its wings. The 2016 Algiers Opera, the upper right-hand corner, was also designed by a Chinese architect, and 90% of its materials were imported from China. I'm pointing this out because in the early 20th century, China became the home of major new theater design, both in number of new theaters and in new experimentation with theaters. And I'll say a little bit more about that later on as I get to those examples. As these examples suggest, thank you, the modern monumental theater has recently shifted its geographical center. For the first 2 centuries, from the late 1700s to the late 1900s, monumental theaters, although they were built around the world, were concentrated in Europe. Today, the overwhelming majority of new such monuments in size and number is appearing in the Far East and especially in China. Now, these reflect every style of modernist monumentalism, but curved-based work is one of the most popular approaches, as we can see in these 4 recent Chinese examples, all of which are very much based on the organic curve. The Hangzhou Grand Theatre, opened in 2005, was created by Petrov architects, and they again echoed Niemeyer in saying this is the theater in the upper left corner. The architects say this was conceived not as an architectural project, but as a sculpture. This concept of the theater not being a piece of architecture, but being a piece of sculpture, which allows the architect to play around with how it fits into space, which may not be as a box, maybe all kinds of other shapes. It's now very typical of the modern monumental theater. They definitely are monumental, though. You can see that each one of these takes up a very large amount of space. And something else, and I'll talk more about this later, is these new monumental theaters are very often not in the center of the city, as the Paris Opéra was, but are at the edge of the city, where they have more space, more open land, and ideally maybe a coastline or an ocean that they can reinforce. So you see the city, it becomes a kind of background, not an environment for these theaters. A similar aesthetic can be seen in the very different 2012 Grand Theater of Jiatin, whose architect also described it in metaphorical terms, this is at the bottom, uniting heaven and earth, and in the 2015 Harbin Grand Theater. Its Beijing designers described it as, quote, appearing as if sculpted by wind and water. The building blends in with nature and the topography of the surrounding wetlands. Resembling the silver ribbon in the sky in summer, the construction melts into its snowy environment during winter. So it really is organic in the purest sense. It's really seeking to blend into the natural environment. Bing Tom, the Chinese-Canadian architect of the new Hong Kong Opera, said the work was based on the Chinese principle of xi, or flow. But he rejected the association with sculpture common to previous flowing architecture, saying his work not sculptural, but experiential. It was trying to create a certain kind of experience in the people who go see it and go into it. Significantly, critics of the theater, well aware of its close relation to recent trends in modernist architecture, have complained that this work did not complain that this work was too European, but said that it was too Chinese, recognizing that this kind of experimentation has now moved to mainland China. This theater was designed for Hong Kong, which tries to keep itself, as you know, culturally separate. Although the curves and flow of organic modernist style remained essentially more popular than the hard straight lines and right angles of the Corbusier style, sometimes called the international style. It should be noted that the old modernist right-angled style still continues to inspire major monumental theaters up to the present. And the next slide shows several recent examples of that more severe rectilinear style. The 2008 Royal Danish Playhouse in Copenhagen, the 2013 Pala Theatre in Bianquan, China, and the 2014 City Theatre in Finland, and the 2019 Almonte Theatre in Huelva, Spain, are 4 examples of this kind of right-angled Le Corbusier modernist theater. The next slide, I start with postmodernism. Now we no longer talk about modernist theater or modernist architecture. Well, we still do, because theaters and other architecture are built in modernist style. But now the more popular term since the 1960s has been postmodernism. As the name suggests, postmodernism is rather, in large part, a reaction to modernism, although it's a very oversimplified idea. Still, according to this view, modernism stressed the formality, the severity, the lack of variety. And by and large, when postmodernists are attacking modernism, saying they all look alike and they're all flat and uninteresting, they're really thinking about brutalism and the flat rectilinear geometric kind of early modernism. They're not really thinking so much about the flowing, organic, later modernists. In any case, the postmodernist postmodernist architecture does not have any single style by its very definition. Every building is unique, and every building grows really out of a concept, an idea of a particular kind of relationship with the surrounding area, a particular kind of relationship with the community where it's based. For example, a postmodernist, the first thing a postmodernist does is look at the community and the site where the theater will be located. Is it next to the ocean or near a big lake? In that case, you need to think possibly about water motifs or water reflections. You might design a theater that is particularly designed to sit at the edge of the water and produce a certain kind of reflection. Are you located near mountains or volcanoes? You might want to suggest in the shape of your theater a volcano or a mountain. Are you situated in a city which is particularly famous for some kind of product or some well, for example, a postmodern architect designing a postmodern theater for Rio de Janeiro might, for example, design a theater that was a small model of Sugarloaf Mountain. Now, you might say, oh, that's a terrible idea. Terrible or not is a very postmodern idea. So we've had theaters in the shape of, well, I'll show you some in the shape of different kinds of objects that reflect on their area. But the main thing is that every theater is unique. It's not as though we're doing a new theater in the style of the Paris Opera, or a new theater in the style of a Greek temple. We're doing a new theater which is especially designed for this particular situation. Now, I have a screen in front of me that doesn't have anything. Well, it has a background of Simpla on it. First of all, let me start there, because the Sydney Opera House, as I've said in many cases, certain buildings or certain theaters are taken as the example of a whole architectural style, like the National Theatre in Great Britain of Brutalism and the Paris Opera of Bozart Style. The Sydney Opera House is often given as an example of postmodern architecture. And what is meant by that is that it's not designed to look like a theater, whatever that looks like. It's its own kind of structure, and it's specifically designed to fit in a particular situation surrounded by water, and its design is meant to suggest things connected with the area surrounding it. For example, the sails of the ships that are around it, or the shells of the clams that are along the coast there. This theater has become a symbol not only of the city of Sydney, but indeed of Australia, like the Eiffel Tower is now a symbol of Paris. And the reason I showed the next slide is that's the poster. The reason I wanted to show you the poster is to show you, because the poster points out how the shape of the Sydney Opera House is like a sail of a boat. That's part of the design. Um, the Sydney Opera House was designed by a Danish architect, and it is really a wonderful example of what we mean by a monumental theater today. First of all, it creates a major urban focus, and geographically and visually, it's very striking. So much so that, as we see in the poster, it can be the symbol of Sydney or the whole continent. Uh, Many observers have noted that the distinctive curved shells of the Sydney Opera suggest shells or sails, and that poster suggests that, both echoing the seaside location. The use of architecture as a visual metaphor was certainly used in modernism. Nehemiah's waves and hills and female bodies would be a good example. But the evocation of non-architectural, especially man-made objects in architecture, became one of the most familiar aspects of postmodernism, although it was only one of many types of postmodernism. There are evocations of man-made objects like sails or natural ones like shells. And here are the examples that I'm showing. I hope you have pictures of the Grand Theater of Wuhan, China, which was designed to look like a Chinese fan. The 2014 Cao Van Lao Theater in Vietnam, which sought to evoke the three cultures of the region by creating three giant traditional Vietnamese hats. You can only see two of them clearly in the illustration, but if you know the kind of hats that look kind of like cones, upside down cones on the head. You can see two of those three cones, and these are to look like three Vietnamese hats, and the theater is built to suggest that. And the new National Theater of Albania, the third one I have here, which is now being built, it stresses national unity by being designed to look like a giant bow tie, which is tied together as the way that Albania has tied together different cultures. I hope that's the slide you're seeing. Please tell me, it will speed things up. Designs suggesting natural objects have often been drawn from the location around the building itself, as in these three recent monumental theaters, the 2017 Zhuhai Grand Opera, which clearly suggests giant clamshells with perhaps a nod to the Sydney Opera, the 2019 Uchi Show Theater, which evokes a bamboo forest in that region, and the Hainan Performing Arts Center, still under construction, which suggests volcanoes and the volcanic activity of that area. The volcanoes that you see there the theater looks like a volcanic area, and the volcanoes actually emit light and smoke when the theater is in operation. The Esplanade Theatre in Singapore, which was completed in 2001, is often called the Asian equivalent of the Sydney Opera House. It's a very famous building. The architects developed its striking design in order to solve certain technical problems related to the panels they were using as a basic covering. But the result was so close to a visual reference to a popular local fruit, the durian, that the two buildings in the complex immediately became generally known as the Big Durians. That is, people named the theater then for the fruit. A less respectful term has been applied, which also indicates a tendency to read such theaters as visual metaphors, and some of the people in the area have come to call them the copulating armadillos. And again, you look at them from on top, you can see why that might be said. Among the most famous or most notorious of these metaphorical or iconic monumental theaters is China's Guangzhou Grand Theater, opened in 2021. Its design is also a visual reference, supposed to look like the flowing curves of a Chinese fabric, as if you had dropped a Chinese scarf or table covering on the ground, and it just fall in a heap. This evokes the city's historical role as the hub of the Chinese silk industry. It was designed by a Norwegian firm, Snuhata, and this is probably the most important architectural firm in the design of theaters today. The Guangzhou Theater achieved the distinction of being named the ugliest building in China in 2021. This is a competition which is a very important part of an unsuccessful attempt by the government and other groups to take down the excesses of recent Chinese architecture. The best known voice of this opposition was an annual competition started in 2020 by a group of architectural consultants. And this competition is called the 10 Ugliest Buildings in China. So for the past 20 years, there's been a list of buildings, which gives you an idea of how extreme postmodern architecture has become in China. The list, although obviously subjective and even whimsical, has attracted national and international attention. On a more official level, President Xi Jinping, the president of China, as early as 2014, at a literary symposium in Beijing, condemned the developing taste in China for what he called weird architecture, saying that architecture should be natural, simple, and as healthful as sunshine. It should inspire minds, warm hearts, cultivate taste, and clean up undesirable work styles. He specifically condemned 2 buildings created that past year in Beijing. Neither one of them happily is a theater, but you can see what he's concerned about. The courthouse building on the left, which is, and you can see it, it's monumental, though not a theater. It's an office building. It's often condemned to a giant pair of pants. And the headquarters of the party newspaper, People's Daily, and its phallic suggestion is hard to deny. Indeed, Jinping said it looked like a giant penis, which it certainly does. And this is the kind of thing he was complaining about. In 2021, the Chinese government actually issued a decree banning ugly or weird architecture and suggesting work pleasing to the eye. What was meant by these vague terms is not clearly defined, however, and it hasn't changed the experimentation in more and more radical theaters. This is clearly shown by the international attention given to the competition for such new theaters. And most of my remarks from here on will be devoted to a design competition held by the city of Busan in South Korea in 2011. This was for a new theater that was supposed to be built. In that, several hundred designs were submitted, and I've taken some selections from them because they give you an idea of what sorts of theaters. These are all projects. What contemporary architects are thinking about when they think about monumental theaters. The first ones that I show you are clearly influenced by modernism, by early modernism. The straight sides, the square angles, the rather box-like feeling of them. There aren't a lot of projects of this kind, but here are several of them that show you that this tradition is still an important part of contemporary monumental architecture. The next slide shows you another set of entries that are very, very different from these. These work with curves, circles, ovoids, egg shapes, and so on. This gives you, as you can see, ovoid or egg-shaped patterns have become very popular in modern architecture. The one down at the lower left-hand corner even looks rather like, if you know the very early silent film, the Méliès film Ovoids to the Moon, It almost looks as though they were trying to create Humilier's rocket ship, but they all have a very futuristic feel to them. Okay, now the some entries are surely would be characterized as weird by President Jinping. These are projects from Russia, Colombia, and Germany that are more or less in the square modernist line, but it's now because technology has improved, one can defy gravity and get build and create buildings that seem to almost be partially floating in the air, so that we get buildings that are much less connected to the ground, as has traditionally been the case. I'm drawing toward a conclusion now. I wanted to say something about looking something I mentioned before, looking back away from placing these theaters in the center of the city, to placing it on the edges in other striking locations. The Sydney Opera is a particularly strong example of that. You notice how it's really quite isolated from the city itself. Let me simply go ahead and conclude here. We're only missing 2 or 3 slides. What the last slides indicate is how monumental theater construction, it really just in the last 15 or 20 years, has now moved from something, the location of theaters has moved from the Roman model to the Greek model. That is, and I had a slide which showed the location of a theater in a Roman city, which is right near the middle of things, and the location of a theater in a Greek city, which is out on the edges of the city. The reason being that the Greeks needed a hillside to build the theater auditorium into. For rather different reasons, we have now shifted from a monumental theater in the center of the city, which is where Voltaire wanted to put it, and where it was up until the end of the 20th century, now to the Greek model of putting it out on the edge of the city, where it can tie into the surrounding architecture, particularly into bodies of water, like the Sydney building. The thing that has not changed, however, indeed, if anything, it's become more important, is the concept of the monumental theater as being a very important part of the idea of a modern city. I mean, all theaters, of course, all cities have theaters of some kind or another, but major cities today, and this is really any place on the globe, major cities seem to feel it's necessary not to just have theaters, but to have at least 1 or 2 monumental theaters that stand out, like the Empire State Building or the Eiffel Tower or the Sydney Opera House. The reason that this is now that China is now at the center of this is the continuing population increase and the continuing urbanization of China. China, unlike almost any place in the world, is creating major new cities at a very rapid pace. And it has become part of the idea of a major new Chinese city that you build a major monumental opera house. So China has built well over 100 of these in the last 10 years and shows no sign of decreasing. Now we see North Korea and Southeast Asia beginning to produce more and more of these. China is likely to remain the leader. And as new materials, new techniques, new technology appears, I think the inventiveness and the variety available to the new monumental theaters is going to continue to increase as well. And we probably will see the most outstanding examples of it in Asia. So I'll stop here. Obrigado. Sorry we had the technical difficulties, but I will. If anybody wants to see particular theaters that they didn't get to see, let me know and I'll email you images of it. Obrigado.
Very good, Marvin. Very good, very interesting, amazing how you know about the history of architecture. Very, very interesting. We have read your book, Places of Performance, but now it's much more. It's very interesting indeed. There are some questions. Can I make the questions to you, please? Can you see any difference of development in these styles between theaters, opera theaters, and theaters for drama?
No, there is the monumental theaters in China are mostly built for not for drama. They're mostly built for musical theater, sometimes Western musicals, more often Chinese musicals, or different kinds of musical spectacular theater. They call them theaters, and they sometimes do drama, but most of them are closer to what we would call opera houses.
There's another question. You have told us about the external aspects of the theater building, the Monumental Theatre building. I would like to know if you see any change in the patterns, the internal patterns of the theatrical theaters, the theatrical buildings, along the centuries, a long time. If you see changes in the internal patterns of the theatrical buildings.
Well, of course, the theater building has many different kinds of internal spaces. The one thing that hasn't changed a lot is sort of the basis of theater, which is a seated audience facing a stage of some kind. That's pretty basic to theater, and almost, I think, every theater I can think of does that. But of course, everything around that changes. That is, there are many different kinds of stages. Sometimes there are multiple stages, or so you the same audience can see 2 or 3 different stages. Stages are different sizes and shapes. Same thing is true of auditoriums. There are many different sizes and shapes. What is the most different theater to theater is the other spaces, the lobbies, the places where the audience comes into the theater, the restaurants, the passageways, all the places outside the actual performance space. Those are very different in different theaters. And also, of course, the backstage spaces are very different. Also, they have different kinds of machinery. They're designed in different ways. There is a very basic similarity just in the actor-audience relationship. But beyond that, the theaters are extremely different.
Thank you, Marvin. It was amazing, very, very good lecture. And we have learned quite a lot. And we hope next year we can invite you alive, okay?
That would be great. Thank you.
That will be great. And we shall do the effort to make it possible, okay? And thank you. I think we have to finish the session now because there's another session. And thank you, Marvin. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Obrigado.